Courtroom in shock when ordinary woman reveals she's an FBI director. Marla Finch first entered the courthouse with small, tentative steps, her gaze lowered to the scuffed marble floors. She wore a modest gray cardigan and a neatly pressed skirt that fell just below her knees, blending seamlessly into the backdrop of the busy corridor. No one cast a second glance her way. The bailiff checking IDs at the entrance waved her through with the same mechanical courtesy he offered every other face in line. A sense of weary resignation hung about her like an invisible cloak, as though she had traveled a long road just to arrive at this unremarkable moment. Outside, the morning light filtered in through narrow windows, illuminating swirling motes of dust in the air. The vast mahogany doors to the courtroom felt imposing, even to the lawyers gathered outside, each wrapped in the tension that so often accompanies high-stakes proceedings. Underneath that tension was a constant buzz, one that Marla could feel but not fully identify. All she knew was that the day felt weighted with expectation, as though the building itself held its breath in anticipation of the trial. Her right hand trembled slightly. She clutched a worn leather purse close to her side. If someone had stood near enough, they might have heard her inhale sharply before stepping past the threshold into the courtroom. Rows of pew-like benches faced the front, where a tall dais sat with the judge's chair high above everything else. In the middle of that space stood a single table designated for the prosecution and another for the defense. The case in question was the talk of the town, a small real estate dispute involving a powerful local businessman, Addison. Marla had been summoned as a witness, although no one could quite figure out why. Few recognized her name, and even fewer had any idea what role she had played in any of Mr.'s business dealings. The rumor was that she had been a tenant in a decrepit apartment complex used to own, or perhaps she had once been a part-time employee at one of his many ventures. Regardless, her presence barely registered among the spectators. Everyone's attention was glued to, and his legal team, a group known for ruthless tactics. Even Marla's seat on the wooden bench was unremarkable. She found a place near the back, hands folded in her lap, posture so rigid it looked almost uncomfortable. Next to her sat a few curious onlookers, and behind her, gossipers exchanged whispered speculation about what might unfold. She avoided eye contact. She appeared to be in every sense an ordinary woman in a sea of onlookers. The judge, a stern-faced man with silver hair and kind but tired eyes, entered promptly at 9. The bailiff called the court to order, and everyone rose. The judge took his seat behind the dais, adjusting his spectacles as he scanned the room. He seemed not to notice Marla, as her presence was overshadowed by the throng of participants and its imposing figure at the defense table. Addison was a tall man, commanding in his presence, with a crisp blue suit that likely cost more than many people's entire wardrobes. He had the practiced confidence of someone used to having the upper hand, a smug twist to his lips that suggested he believed himself well out of reach of any real consequence. The opening statements began. The lead prosecutor, a wiry woman named Marshall, laid out her case with carefully chosen words. She spoke of illicit property deals, intimidation tactics, and manipulated lease agreements. Enough evidence, she hoped, to prove that had systematically cheated multiple families out of their homes. The tension in the room heightened as she described, in detail, the stories of those affected. But the underlying current was that high-priced defense team had managed to whittle down the charges to a single property dispute that seemed more procedural than criminal. It smelled strongly of injustice to many. His lawyer was a smooth-talking man who oozed charm and wore an expensive watch that glinted under the overhead fluorescence. He dismissed the prosecution's accusations as exaggerated misunderstandings, painting as a businessman who offered more philanthropic support to local charities than any other individual in the county. The man's voice was like silk, a skillful orator that held the jury's attention, even if many in the audience felt themselves squirm with unease. Through all of this, Marla sat quietly. She made no fuss, no sudden movements to draw attention. There was no outward sign that she felt anything but quiet nerves, but inside her mind, a storm brewed. She listened carefully to every word, her pulse thudding with a sense of purpose far deeper than anyone around her could guess. She noted each contradiction, each half-truth, each outright lie, and with every smug glance from her resolve strengthened. 2 hours in, the trial broke for a short recess. The spectators spilled out into the corridor, some heading for the vending machines, others stepping outside for a breath of fresh air. Marla lingered in a corner, scanning the hallway as if expecting to see someone. Her eyes settled on Marshall, the prosecutor, who stood near the restrooms, reviewing her notes with a furrowed brow. Marla took a hesitant step forward, summoning her courage. "I'm sorry to bother you, Ms. Marshall," she said in a voice that wavered with nerves. My name is Marla Finch." Looked up, eyes flicking over the modest woman with gentle curiosity. "Yes, Ms. Finch, I saw your name on the witness list. Are you all right?" "I will be," Marla replied quietly. I wanted to thank you for taking on this case. I know it's complicated and I've followed some of the proceedings before today. I appreciate your tenacity." Offered a tired smile. "Well, I'm just doing my job, though I'll be honest. Lawyers are making it an uphill battle. They've got resources and they're not afraid to use every trick in the book." Marla nodded. "I believe in what you're doing," she said simply. Her voice took on a subtle firmness. "Don't let them intimidate you." With that, Marla turned and disappeared into the crowd before could respond. The prosecutor was left standing there, a little perplexed but oddly encouraged by the woman's quiet confidence. When the court reconvened, witness after witness took the stand. Most were people who had once rented properties from. Some told stories of sudden evictions. Others spoke of mysterious surcharges that appeared on rent statements, forcing them to either pay more than they owed or risk losing their homes. The defense team systematically poked holes in each testimony, pointing to legal clauses and disclaimers hidden in lease agreements. More than once, the defense insinuated that the witnesses were negligent or had simply misunderstood the terms. By mid-afternoon, the courtroom grew restless. One witness, an elderly woman with a hunched back, broke down in tears, recounting how her father's retirement fund had all but vanished in a legal battle with real estate arm. She felt, she said through choked sobs, that she had nowhere else to turn, and that's why she had come forward. But under cross-examination, the lawyer gently yet firmly cast doubt on the reliability of her memory, and the witness left the stand trembling. A hush spread over the room, an unsettling reminder of how the wealthy and powerful often shape the narrative to their advantage. Throughout it all, barely registered emotion. Occasionally, he'd lean over to whisper instructions to his lawyer, or he'd sip water with an air of disinterest. His eyes never once scanned the gallery in search of Marla or any other lesser-known faces. Finally, late in the day, the bailiff called Marla Finch to the stand. Marla rose from her seat. If anyone paid attention, they might have noticed the subtle transformation in her posture, just a hint of steel in her spine. A few heads turned, curious about this nobody witness who had an air of determined calm around her. She walked to the front, was sworn in, and sat down, face composed, eyes guarded. Marshall approached. "Ms. Finch, can you please state your full name and occupation for the record?" Marla's voice was steady. "My name is Marla Finch, and I am currently—" She paused for half a second. "I'm a freelance security consultant." There was no mention of the FBI, no mention of law enforcement at all. It elicited no reaction from the crowd. The judge nodded, presumably believing her statement to be routine. Continued. "Thank you, Miss Finch. How did you first come into contact with Mr.?" Marla took a breath. "I rented a room in one of the properties he managed, a modest apartment complex on the outskirts of town. I lived there for about 3 months until I was forcibly evicted. There was a ripple of interest in the gallery, but it was faint. Many had already heard stories like this throughout the day." The routine nature of her words elicited more of the same. Half the onlookers suspected she was just another victim, someone who'd been kicked out and had nowhere else to go. Frowned. "Would you tell us the circumstances of that eviction?" Marla nodded. "Of course. My lease agreement stated that rent was due on the 1st of every month. I paid on time for the first 2 months, always in cash, as required by the manager. Then in the 3rd month, I was informed that the rent check had bounced, which wasn't possible because I'd paid in cash. I tried to dispute it, but I was told that the eviction notice had already been filed with the court. When I went to the manager, they refused to give me a receipt. The next day, I found my belongings on the curb and my lock changed. Several people in the front row exchanged sympathetic glances, nodded gravely. This mirrors similar testimonies. Did you attempt to pursue legal action against Mr. or his management?" "Yes, initially I considered it," Marla replied. "But at the time, I didn't have sufficient evidence and the manager receiving my payment. Without proof, I stood little chance. Sighed, thank you, no further questions." She moved to sit, but then paused, looking at Marla as if something was left unsaid. Nevertheless, she returned to her seat, leaving defense to cross-examine. The attorney, the smooth-talking man, sauntered up to the witness stand with polished confidence. "Ms. Finch," he began, "I'm sorry to hear about your troubles, but do you have any proof, like bank statements or receipts, that you actually paid that third month of rent in cash?" Marla met his gaze without flinching. "No, I don't have a physical receipt." He spread his hands theatrically. "So, effectively, it's your word against that of the property manager." "Yes, that's correct," Marla said. Her voice was calm. He offered her a sympathetic smile that had a hint of condescension. "Well, Miss Finch, I don't doubt you believe your version of events, but the law requires evidence, and your recollection, while compelling, lacks the necessary supporting documents. Are you aware of that?" Marla gave a small nod. "Yes, I'm aware." His smile widened. "No further questions, Your Honor." The judge instructed Marla she could step down. She did so quietly, returning to her seat. Around her, people wore expressions of pity or mild disappointment. It seemed her testimony did nothing to substantially bolster the prosecution's case. If anything, it fit neatly into the pattern of unfortunate, but unprovable, allegations. Marla, however, retained her composure, her lips pressed into a thin line, waiting. Over the next couple of days, the trial progressed in a similar fashion. His team methodically dismantled each witness's credibility, sowing seeds of doubt. The judge, adhering to procedure, allowed these cross-examinations because no rules were technically being broken. Though he occasionally shot disapproving glances at lawyers' theatrics, it wasn't enough to stop the defense from painting each accusation as shaky, unsupported by hard evidence. During breaks, Marla would drift in the background, quietly observing. At one point, she bumped into an old friend, a local journalist named who barely recognized her. He did a double take. "Marla, I haven't seen you in ages. I heard you moved away," said, adjusting the strap of his camera bag. "I did for a while." Her voice was pleasant but non-committal, looked around conspiratorially. "So are you writing a story on this? I'm about to file something for tomorrow's paper, but there's not much new to say. Seems untouchable. And if we're being honest, my editor is spooked. Threatens lawsuits left and right." Marla's lips curved into a hint of a smile. "I'm not writing a story, just paying attention. Maybe you should keep paying attention, too." Gave her a questioning look, but before he could press further, the bailiff announced that recess was over. Marla gently excused herself and returned to her bench. By the end of the third day, the prosecution had wrapped up, and the defense prepared to present its case. Everyone expected the proceedings to end swiftly. Had powerful allies, expensive experts who that all transactions were above board, and no shortage of skillful rhetoric. Rumor had it that would likely walk away with a minor fine, if that. The local chatter was that justice had once again been neatly packaged by the highest bidder. On the morning of the fourth day, as the defense began calling its witnesses, Marla took her usual seat in the back. She wore the same nondescript outfit she had worn earlier in the week, again drawing no attention. The judge appeared resigned. The jurors seemed fatigued by the repetitive parade of technical testimony offered by experts. The air in the courtroom felt stale, the tension that once bristled now replaced by a growing sense of inevitability. But then, something unusual happened. The judge motioned for a short sidebar with the attorneys after one of so-called character witnesses gave an oddly evasive answer. A buzz arose among the onlookers. When the judge returned from his private conference with the lawyers, he cleared his throat. "Before we proceed, I've been informed that the prosecution would like to recall a witness to the stand," the judge said. He adjusted his glasses, looking at Marshall. "Ms. Marshall, please proceed." Rose, trying to maintain a calm exterior, through her eyes glinted with a new spark of determination. "Yes, Your Honor," she said, her voice carrying a note of triumph she had not displayed before. "The prosecution would like to recall Ms. Marla Finch to the stand." A flicker of annoyance flashed across his face. He leaned toward his lawyer, whispering harshly. His lawyer shrugged as if to say, "We can handle it." Marla stood once again. A faint wave of murmurs rippled through the courtroom, as people found it strange that this quiet, seemingly inconsequential witness was being recalled. She approached the stand with slow, deliberate steps, placed her hand on the Bible to be resworn, and took her seat. Marshall approached, her posture than it had been for the entire trial. "Ms. Finch, upon further investigation, new information has come to light that directly involves you in this case. At this time, I'd like to ask you to restate your occupation, accurately and completely, for for the record. Marla's eyes flickered almost imperceptibly, then settled once. She inhaled deeply, then turned to face the judge. "My name is Marla Finch," she began, her voice echoing through the silent chamber. "And I am the Assistant Director in charge of the Criminal Investigations Division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation." A collective gasp swept through the gallery. Even the judge appeared taken aback, lowering his glasses to the desk with an expression of stunned surprise. Jurors exchanged wide-eyed glances, and its defense team looked momentarily shell-shocked. Addison himself stiffened, eyes narrowing. The hush in the courtroom was so profound that Marla's next words seemed to reverberate off the paneled walls. "I have been working undercover," she continued, "as part of a broader federal investigation into Mr.'s alleged criminal activities. The name Marla Finch is my real name, but I deliberately my full credentials to avoid tipping off the defense. My direct involvement in this case goes much deeper than a simple eviction." Judge Martinez cleared his throat, his voice trembling slightly from the shock. You're an FBI director, assistant director in charge," he repeated. Marla gave a measured nod. "Yes, Your Honor. I understand this is highly unconventional, but the ongoing investigation's integrity demanded secrecy. The prosecution only became fully aware of my role late last night, when certain pieces of evidence were at my request." Suddenly, the once mild-mannered woman in gray looked every inch an authoritative figure. The entire atmosphere in the courtroom shifted as though someone had opened a window to let in a blast of cold wind. There was a new tension in the air, but it wasn't the same hopeless tension from before. This was something charged with possibility, with fear and the promise of revelations that could upend everything. Picked up a folder from her desk. "For the sake of clarity, Ms. Finch, Assistant Director Finch, could you please tell the court what new evidence has come to light?" Marla straightened her shoulders. "Certainly, I have in my possession, and I believe me. Marshall also has copies, documents that outline a network of fraudulent shell companies tied to Mr.'s real estate empire. These documents were obtained legally through federal warrants. They detail how certain properties were used to launder money, and how false ledgers were created to justify evictions and inflate rent costs for tax evasion purposes. There are bank statements, emails, and signed affidavits from individuals who, prior to the FBI's protective measures, feared retaliation from Mr. Additionally, we have recorded phone conversations where Mr. or his associates blatantly discuss forging payment records to orchestrate evictions." A stunned silence followed her statement. Each piece of evidence she mentioned landed with a metaphorical thud on the courtroom floor. Spectators stared, jaws slack. Some turned to look at, expecting an immediate rebuttal, but he seemed momentarily lost for words, pinned to his seat by the weight of incrimination. His lawyer scrambled to maintain composure, but even the practiced attorney looked pale. Marla continued, her voice unwavering. "The reason I posed as a victim tenant was to gather first-hand experience of how management company dealt with tenants. It was crucial to observe their operations at ground level. What I experienced was precisely the scenario described by many witnesses. Eviction notices, non-existent receipts, and threats of violence when confronted. I have since submitted a sworn statement detailing all of this, accompanied by clandestine recordings made during my residency in the building." The shock wave that coursed through the audience was palpable. The local journalist, seated in the back, felt his heart pound with excitement and disbelief. This story was bigger than anything he could have imagined. He scrambled to take notes, hands shaking with adrenaline. Judge Martinez raised a hand to restore order as hushed murmurs broke out. "I will have order in this court." His voice thundered through the cavernous room. Once the whispers died down, he spoke directly to Marla. "Assistant Director Finch, why was this information until now? Surely the court has the right to be informed." Marla's expression was respectful yet resolute. "Your Honor, the FBI is building a larger case that extends beyond just this property dispute. If the defense had been made aware of my true identity, it would have compromised several active undercover operations. However, due to recent developments and leaks, we were forced to accelerate our timeline. We made the decision to reveal my identity now to ensure justice is served and prevent Mr. from evading accountability for his crimes." The judge exhaled, leaning back in his chair as if grappling with the magnitude of the revelation. "Very well," he said, rubbing his temples. "Ms. Marshall, please proceed with your examination." Swallowed, her composure returning. Ms. Finch, can you corroborate for the jury the authenticity of these documents and recordings? Marla inclined her head. Yes, these materials were obtained under valid warrants, authorized through federal court. They have been vetted by forensic experts who can testify to their authenticity. I'm prepared to present the chain of custody documentation as well. Nodded, then addressed the judge. Your Honor, at this time, the prosecution would like to submit these documents into evidence. She walked to the clerk, handing over thick folders. Instantly, lawyer leaped to his feet. Objection, Your Honor. We haven't had a chance to review these documents properly. This is an ambush. Judge Martinez's gaze flickered to the lawyer. I share your concern about the late introduction of evidence, counselor. However, given the circumstances and the source, I'm inclined to allow these documents. The defense will be granted additional time to review them. The lawyer's jaw clenched. He knew he had no easy way to dismiss or discredit the FBI's involvement without more information. We request a recess to examine this new material thoroughly, Your Honor. The judge nodded. Granted. This court will reconvene tomorrow morning at 9. In the meantime, the defense may review all newly presented evidence. Court is adjourned for today. The gavel struck, and the room erupted in a cacophony of voices. News reporters rushed forward, some trying to catch a statement from Marla Finch, others hounding, whose face was now ashen. The entire proceeding had flipped on its head in a matter of minutes. Outside the courtroom, the media frenzy was immediate. Cameras flashed, microphones were thrust forward, and voices clamored for sound bites. Marla, for her part, tried to navigate the chaos with a stoic calm that betrayed little of the turmoil inside her. She was resolute in her mission, but not numb. The swirl of cameras and question-shouting journalists left her pulse racing. Managed to stave off the worst of the crowd, ushering Marla into a quieter hallway. Once they were relatively alone, the prosecutor's professional facade cracked just a little. I had no idea, she breathed. You never gave the slightest indication. I knew something was different about you, but I never guessed you were FBI, let alone an assistant director. Marla lowered her voice. I'm sorry I kept you in the dark. The success of the operation depended on secrecy. I appreciate your diligence. Without your push in court, we might not have found the perfect opportunity to reveal our evidence. You held the line, even when it looked hopeless. Exhaled and gave a short laugh. In all my years, I've never seen a twist like that. I just hope it's enough. His team is relentless. Marla's jaw set. It will be enough. The documents are indisputable. And with the witness testimonies we already have, there's a strong case to prove orchestrated a multi-layered criminal enterprise. Nodded, a spark of renewed confidence lighting her eyes. Then let's take him down. Word spread like wildfire across the city. An FBI assistant director had infiltrated its organization and was now set to expose massive fraud. By morning, the courthouse swelled with curious locals, media crews, and additional law enforcement presence. Even people who had never stepped foot in a courtroom found themselves drawn to the spectacle. Marla arrived early, unaccompanied, slipping in through a side entrance to avoid the throng gathered at the main doors. A few eagle-eyed reporters spotted her anyway, snapping photos before she disappeared into a restricted corridor. Meanwhile, entered through the front, flanked by his defense team. He maintained a stiff upper lip, but anxiety etched lines in his face. When the session reconvened, the atmosphere was far more charged than it had been. The judge's stern eyes regarded the defense table. A sense of dramatic expectancy filled the room, as though everyone was waiting to see if Saturni had any magic left to spin. But the real question was, how do you fight an FBI assistant director with a pile of evidence that threatened to blow the entire wide open? Marshall wasted no time calling Marla Finch, Assistant Director Finch, back to the stand. The hush that fell over the room was absolute. Even the bailiff, who had seen 1,000 trials, looked on with undisguised interest. Marla resumed her seat and waited for it to begin. Ms. Finch, the court is now aware of your role in the FBI. Please tell us exactly what you discovered during your undercover assignment. Marla spoke with a calm clarity. Over the course of 4 months, I gathered evidence on Mr. illegal practices. One of the key strategies was fabricating reasons to evict tenants who questioned rent hikes or who unknowingly stood in the way of his plan to repurpose buildings for a higher profit. These evictions enabled associates to flip properties quickly, sometimes selling them to out-of-state shell companies, entities he secretly owned, and then reinvesting the laundered money elsewhere. The circle of transactions ensured that each property's paper trail appeared legitimate unless someone delved deeper, as the FBI did. She paused, scanning the faces of the jury. In addition, Mr. Intimidation methods weren't limited to financial manipulation. We have testimonies from witnesses who received threats of violence against them or their families if they attempted to challenge these evictions. Some of those individuals have now come forward under federal protection. The moral weight of her statements settled in the room. Jurors exchanged uneasy looks, as did many in the audience. The judge leaned forward, hands clasped, giving Marla his full attention. Approached the witness stand, holding a small USB drive. Your Honor, with the court's permission, we'd like to play audio recordings that Assistant Director Finch obtained while undercover. The judge, his voice subdued, replied, "Proceed." A hush fell as the bailiff set up a small speaker system. Marla identified each recording by date and context. The first was a conversation between a property manager and associate. The manager complained about a tenant who kept asking for a receipt. The associate responded with a scornful laugh, stating, "We don't do receipts. If she keeps pushing, we'll put her out on the street." Said to move fast on that one, he wants the building empty by month's end. There was an audible reaction from the gallery, soft gasps, uneasy whispers. More recordings followed, each piling evidence that organization had systematically victimized tenants. One clip even captured Sohn's voice, though he tried to speak in code. "The ledger's been taken care of," he said. "If anyone goes digging, they'll see an overdue payment, no proof of deposit. By the time they figure it out, we'll be long gone." The gallery was riveted. Every time's name was mentioned, heads turned to see if he would react. He sat rigid, jaw clenched so tight the muscle in his neck twitched. When the last recording ended, turned to Marla, her voice steady. "Assistant Director Finch, can you confirm the authenticity of these recordings?" "I can," Marla answered confidently. "They were made using authorized equipment provided by the FBI. Original, unedited copies have been preserved and by our digital forensics team." Nodded. "Your Honor, we request that these recordings be admitted into evidence as well." The judge, ashen-faced but composed, nodded. "They are admitted. The jury will consider them in their deliberations." Now it was the defense's turn. His lawyer, eyes bloodshot from likely spending the entire night reviewing the damning documents, approached the stand. His usually smooth demeanor was frayed at the edges. "Assistant Director Finch," he began, his tone more measured than before. "While we acknowledge your position, the defense questions the legality of your undercover operations. Specifically, were proper warrants obtained for these recordings?" Marla met his gaze. "Yes, they were. The FBI with all legal guidelines for undercover operations of this nature." He nodded curtly. "These audio files, how do we know they haven't been edited or manipulated?" Marla arched an eyebrow. "The FBI has robust forensics protocols. Each recording is time-stamped and hashed. Any alteration would be detectable." The defense lawyer glanced at his notes. "And you claim you personally witnessed or experienced an unlawful eviction orchestrated by Mr. Associates. Yet previously, you said you had no receipt. Doesn't that contradict your claim that you had a plan all along to document these actions?" Marla's expression didn't falter. "My original strategy was to gather the necessary intel without arousing suspicion. Presenting a receipt for rent would have compromised the operation if they suspected I was building evidence. The eviction scenario offered me insight into how they handled disputes. Even though I didn't physically produce a receipt, the recordings, as you heard, indicate that they orchestrated my eviction with full knowledge I had paid on time." A ripple of unease passed through the defense table. The lawyer glanced at who subtly signaled him to keep fighting. Drawing in a breath, he said, "You put on a convincing show, Miss Finch. But in your quest to gather evidence, is it possible that some innocent bystanders, people who believed you to be a genuine tenant, were misled? Could that not cast doubt on your moral standing in this entire affair?" For the first time, Marla's posture stiffened. "I regret any hardship my undercover work may have indirectly caused others. But any misdirection was necessary to expose a larger criminal enterprise. The real moral question lies in how Mr.'s actions destroyed countless lives and broke numerous laws." The lawyer's gaze faltered, aware the moral high ground belonged to her. With one last glance at his notes, he said, "No further questions." When Marla stepped down, the courtroom felt alive with reawakened energy. Those who had come expecting a perfunctory legal proceeding found themselves witnessing a dramatic unveiling of corruption. Reporters scribbled furiously, and the tension was electric as himself was called to the stand. All eyes fell on him. The once confident businessman now looked weary. Under direct examination by his own attorney, tried to maintain his usual poise. He insisted he had no personal knowledge of any wrongdoing, claiming that any misconduct was solely the work of rogue managers. He painted himself as a philanthropist, a believer in fair housing who had been betrayed by unscrupulous employees. But it came off hollow, especially in light of the recordings where his voice explicitly referenced ledgers and intimidation. Then it was turn. She approached the stand with the quiet determination of someone who knows the facts are on her side. "Mister," she began, "you claim you had no knowledge of the systemic fraud and intimidation tactics used against tenants. Yet in the tapes presented, you can be heard instructing your associate to fabricate an overdue rent ledger. Would you care to explain that?" His face tightened. I wasn't referring to anything illegal. We were discussing legitimate record-keeping, just reorganizing some overdue payments so they matched up with standard accounting practices. Raised an eyebrow, which included forging rent ledgers. He shifted uncomfortably. That might have been poor wording on my part. I never told anyone to forge anything. My associate must have misunderstood. A cynical murmur spread through the spectators, nodded solemnly. "So your defense is that these tapes were misinterpreted?" Latched onto that? "Yes, completely taken out of context. I often speak in shorthand with my associates." His tone sharpened. "Did your shorthand also involve telling your associate to ensure? We'll be long gone before they figure it out," referring to tenants and authorities. He sputtered. "That was a joke, an offhand remark, hyperbole. I wasn't planning to do anything illegal, for God's sake." Went in for the kill. "Mister, can you also explain the network of shell companies that lead back to your personal accounts? Companies that purchased these distressed properties after you'd forcibly evicted tenants who had, in many cases, already paid their rent. Companies that show up on your personal tax returns as substantial income sources." Swallowed, and the color drained from his face. "Those were legitimate business entities recommended by my lawyers. I don't oversee every detail. I have accountants for that." Despite every denial, it was clear that carefully constructed image was collapsing under the weight of evidence. The moral condemnation in the room was tangible. It was no longer just about shady evictions. It was about orchestrated financial crimes designed to prey on vulnerable people. And at the heart of it all was a powerful man who believed he was untouchable, until now. Deliberations began late in the day. Juries rarely decide a verdict in a single session, especially in complex financial cases. But the evidence was overwhelming, and the discussions stretched into the early evening. Tension mounted in the hallway as reporters, lawyers, and spectators waited. Paced, face drawn, occasionally shooting venomous glares toward Marla, who stood at the far end of the corridor with a phone pressed to her ear, quietly updating her superiors at the FBI. When the jury filed back into the courtroom just before 9 at night, a startled hush descended. Everyone scrambled back to their seats, hearts pounding at the prospect of a verdict coming so soon. His lawyer looked stunned, mouth slightly ajar, as though he hadn't expected them to finish so quickly. The foreman stood, a middle-aged man with a resolute bearing. He handed a slip of paper to the bailiff, who passed it to the judge. Judge Martinez read it silently, gave a curt nod, and handed it back. He cleared his throat. "In the matter of the People versus Addison," he began, "the jury finds the defendant guilty on all counts." For a second, the world seemed suspended in silence. Then, all at once, the room erupted. Cameras flashed, spectators broke into hushed cheers, and a wave of relief swept over those who had come forward to testify against. The judge rapped his gavel repeatedly to regain control. "Order in the court," he bellowed. Once the noise subsided, he turned to, whose head hung low, the color drained from his face. "Sentencing will be scheduled at a later date, but let it be known that these are serious offenses. Mister, you will be remanded to custody until sentencing." As two bailiffs approached to escort away, he twisted around, directing a furious glare at Marla Finch. You set me up," he hissed. "I hope you can live with yourself." Marla met his anger with a calm intensity. "I can, and I do. Now you'll have to live with the consequences of your actions." Was let out, seething with impotent rage. The gallery seemed to collectively exhale, as if releasing years of tension in a single breath. Outside, the media frenzy was unstoppable. Microphones and cameras angled for shots of Marla. She hesitated, mindful of FBI protocols. Eventually, she stepped forward, surrounded by local law enforcement who formed a protective barrier. The journalist she knew raised his voice above the din. "Assistant Director Finch, do you have a statement for the public?" Marla paused, scanning the crowd. This was more than a local matter now. It had become a national talking point about corruption, undercover stings, and the systemic abuse of power. She took a slow breath, knowing the weight of her next words. "The FBI's mission is to protect the public from criminals who believe they're above the law," she began, her voice amplified by the cluster of microphones. "No one, no matter how wealthy or influential, should be able to manipulate the legal system for personal gain. This case is a testament to the resilience of those who dare to stand up for what's right, even when it feels futile. We must never underestimate the power of truth and perseverance. It can take time, it can take sacrifice, but justice can prevail." At that, she stepped away from the cameras. Journalists still clamored for more, but she offered no further comment. She was, after all, an FBI official, and the matter was still subject to ongoing procedures. Later that night, long after the courthouse lights dimmed, Marla found herself walking along a quiet stretch of sidewalk near the city center. She had chosen to move without her usual entourage, craving a moment of solitude after the emotional whirlwind. The city skyline glowed faintly in the distance, but the streets here were mostly deserted, except for the occasional car passing by. She stopped at a small park bench under a flickering street lamp. Sitting there, she let the cool night air settle around her. She reflected on everything that had transpired: the months of undercover work, the real fear she felt when she walked into his property manager's office to pay her rent in cash, unsure whether her cover would hold. She remembered the heartbreak on the faces of evicted tenants, people who didn't have the safety net of federal protection. She closed her eyes, picturing the judge's gavel, the stunned faces of jurors, the look of betrayal on his face when he realized he'd been outmaneuvered by someone he had deemed too insignificant to notice. In that quiet moment, a wave of mixed emotions washed over her. Triumph, certainly, for seeing justice served, but also sadness for the people who had suffered under schemes, for those whose lives would never return to what they once were, even if compensation was eventually granted. And there was a pang of guilt, too, for the deceptions she'd had to employ. The undercover role she played did not always allow for compassion or full honesty with the people she encountered. It was a burden she carried, but one she knew was necessary. Eventually, she stood, her breath visible in the cool air. A conviction settled in her chest, an unshakable reminder of why she joined the FBI in the first place. It wasn't about the rush of taking down a high-profile criminal or receiving accolades. It was about the simple, powerful truth that people deserved fairness, that no one should be able to buy or bully their way into ruining others' lives. She started to walk again, footsteps echoing softly on the pavement. In the weeks that followed, the aftermath of the trial rippled through the community and beyond. Several of his accomplices were arrested and charged. Meanwhile, the press alternated between hailing Marla as a hero and scrutinizing the ethical implications of her undercover methods. The story even captured national attention. Some debated whether it was appropriate for the FBI to withhold crucial information from the prosecution until the last minute, but most recognized the necessity of secrecy in cases involving widespread corruption. Marla spent those weeks in a whirlwind of briefings, paperwork, and additional investigations. She coordinated with local authorities to ensure that anyone who had been wrongfully evicted or financially harmed would be of legal pathways to seek restitution. Despite the heavy workload, Marla felt energized. For all the moral complexities and personal sacrifices, this was why she did what she did: to see tangible, positive change. Perhaps most rewarding were the quiet conversations she had with individuals who had at great personal risk. Some were being offered witness protection. Others were receiving financial assistance from charitable organizations once affiliated with organizations that were now under new management. She noticed a renewed sense of hope in their voices. People who had once felt powerless dared to believe in the justice system again. One afternoon, caught up with her outside a local government office, camera slung over his shoulder. He gave her a respectful nod. "Got a minute?" he asked. Marla paused, her face composed. "Sure," she said softly, pressed the record button on a small handheld recorder. "So we've all seen the headlines. National news is calling this a landmark case, exposing corruption in real estate. I wanted to get your personal take on the moral lesson behind all of this. Marla considered the question. The moral lesson is that no matter how ordinary you feel, no matter how stacked the odds seem, you must never give up on doing what's right, she began, her voice steady. Too often, people in positions of power rely on intimidation and manipulation to keep others silent. But change happens when good people decide enough is enough. And sometimes it takes one hidden truth, one moment of courage, to topple an entire structure built on lies. Nodded, clearly moved. Powerful words, thank you, Miss Finch. She gave a tight smile. Thank you, take care. Then she turned and headed off, her steps purposeful but unhurried. That evening, the city was alive with an undercurrent of cautious optimism. Word spread of potential reforms in local government, new ordinances to protect tenants, and a wave of public support for anti-corruption measures. Outside the old courthouse, a small candlelight vigil was held by residents who had lost their homes. They placed their candles on the steps, illuminating the worn stone in gentle light, a solemn tribute to the hardships they had endured and the justice they finally felt was within reach. Marla passed by on her way out of a late meeting. She paused at a respectful distance, not wanting to intrude. She recognized some of the faces, people who had shared their stories, trembling on the witness stand, uncertain if anyone would believe them. They had new hope now, and in a moment of shared humanity, she allowed herself the smallest sigh of relief. She knew their lives weren't magically fixed. There would be struggles ahead. Legal proceedings to recover stolen funds, the emotional toll of rebuilding. But the sense of empowerment, the knowledge that a manipulative tyrant could be brought down, lingered in the air like a promise. Marla's phone buzzed in her purse. She took it out. It was a call from FBI headquarters. With a final glance at the glowing candles, she answered quietly, Finch speaking. Then, with measured steps, she walked away from the courthouse, her silhouette blending into the night, a figure carrying both the burden and the satisfaction of the day's events. Months later, the sentencing hearing arrived. Though overshadowed by the drama of the initial trial, this day was no less important. A throng of people gathered at the courthouse again, though with less spectacle this time. The judge handed down a lengthy prison term along with stiff financial penalties. Additional charges related to money laundering and racketeering added even more years to his sentence. As soon as the judgment was read, glared defiantly at Marla once again. But this time, his venomous stare seemed more resigned than outraged, a final moment of bitterness before he was led away in shackles. The moral scales had tipped, and his illusion of invincibility was shattered beyond repair. Marshall, exhausted but triumphant, thanked Marla as they walked out of the courtroom. "We did it," she said, her voice almost disbelieving. "Justice was served. Honestly, if you hadn't come forward with all that evidence." Marla interrupted with a gentle smile. "You would have found a way. You were fighting for those people long before I showed up." Rick gave her a warm look, acknowledging the shared responsibility in this victory. "Still, I'm glad we had you on our side." Outside, the sun bathed the courthouse steps in a golden glow. A small knot of reporters waited, but Marla didn't stop to talk. They simply walked away side by side, feeling the rush of relief that only comes after a hard-won battle. A few yards away, a group of onlookers, former tenants had wronged, broke into spontaneous applause when they saw Marla. She hesitated, not accustomed to being the center of public gratitude. A modest wave was all she offered in return, a silent acknowledgement of their praise. Driving away from the courthouse for the last time in this case, Marla rolled down the window to inhale the crisp, early autumn air. She thought about everything that had transpired, the humiliations endured by the tenants, her own careful infiltration, the final revelations in court. The entire journey was marked by heartbreak, tension, and small moments of hope that flourished into a resounding, unexpected triumph. As she navigated the winding city streets, her mind drifted to the moral of it all. People often think justice is something abstract or out of reach, but it's the accumulation of individual actions, some small, some risky, that weaves the net to catch those who believe themselves above the law. It's the frail, trembling voice of a witness who refuses to be silenced. It's the relentless work of a prosecutor who won't back down, even when the odds are steep. It's the quiet resolve of someone labeled an ordinary woman who wields the power of truth like a hidden blade until the exact moment to strike. She recalled the gavel's echo in the silent courtroom, the collective gasp when she revealed her identity, the stunned disbelief on the faces of those who had dismissed her. That was the moment the tide turned, the moment an ordinary woman shattered the illusion that its influence was unassailable. In truth, Marla Finch was far from ordinary. Yet her story showed that within the most unassuming individuals could lie an unbreakable spirit, a wellspring of bravery capable of overturning even the most entrenched injustice. And perhaps that was the greatest moral of all. One should never underestimate the quiet presence at the back of the room, the figure who seems to have no power, because that might just be the person who changes everything. Feeling the cool breeze on her face as the city receded in her mirror, Marla Finch allowed a small, satisfied smile. She headed back to the FBI field office to continue her work, carrying the knowledge that justice had prevailed in a place where, for so long, people believed it never could. It was a reminder that ordinary appearances can hide extraordinary strength, and that truth, when wielded by those determined enough, can indeed set the world right, even if it has to do so one courtroom